I went up to Davidson when he was running the Civil War Roundtable up there and gave some programs, and he's been down a couple of times to visit us. But Bill Pender's a longtime friend to many people in this room, and a very fine historian, and a Civil War buff like few others. He's a member of the 28th North Carolina Regiment. He told me he's a member, but he doesn't do any reenacting anymore. And so I guess he's like me. He's reached the stage where he wants younger folks to do that. And today he's going to talk about April 1865, the month that saved the Union. So let's give Bill Pender a big hand.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's certainly a pleasure to be here with a group of people that realize that the war didn't end after Gettysburg, and that Abraham Lincoln was not a simple rail splitter, but a very astute politician, a railroad lawyer, and he had many compliments paid to him by all kinds of people. I happen to be an admirer of his in a certain way. I think he was a very strong president. I don't often agree with him, but he was a man of substance, and of course we had a lot of those people in the South as well. So I'm trying to give you an impartial program, and it would be my wish and expectation that when you go home, take some thoughts with you and do your own research on the Civil War. It was a horrible war, and many scholars think it was not necessary, and there were many reasons for it. Today, we have a polarization in this nation like we haven't had, in my humble judgment, since the 1860s. And we had a similar polarization in the 1860s, the issue being whether or not there was an abuse of presidential authority. And that is very much on the minds of people today. And I could arguably say that North Carolina went out of the Union on that very point. And let me make that clearer by reading these words from Governor Ellis, who preceded Governor Vance. And it was a response to Simon Cameron, who was Lincoln's Secretary of War. At that time, Arkansas and Tennessee and Virginia and North Carolina were in the Union. They weren't part of the original 7 states that seceded and set up the provincial government in Montgomery, Alabama. Ellis was a Union man until this happened. He received a telegram from Simon Cameron, and it read, this is War Department, April the 15th, this would have been in 1861. Call made on you by tonight's mail for 2 regiments of military for immediate use, that is to help the Lincoln government subjugate the South. This is how Ellis replied. Your dispatch is received, and if genuine, which its ordinary character leads me to doubt, I have to say in reply that I regard the levy of troops made by the administration for the purpose of subjugating the states of the South as in violation of the Constitution and a gross usurpation of power. I can be no party to this wicked violation of the laws of the country and the Constitution, and to this war upon the liberties of a free people. You will get no troops from North Carolina. And North Carolina went out of the Union on that point, probably more than any other. It wasn't so much the tariffs, it certainly wasn't slavery, but it was a huge constitutional issue about what the Constitution said and what the powers of the president were. Having said that, that gives you a little bit of an introduction to tonight's program, and what I've done, I've sort of replicated these charts, and it's designed to keep me in line. I want to stay in line with the program. I can refer to them and not deviate, which I sometimes do when I get a little cloudy with other facts, and it'll also help you. We can sort of stay in line together as to what happened in April 1865, and in order to do that, I would like to start toward the end. By that I mean the great stillness at Appomattox. And the amazing story to me, and I'm going to read from this book called April 1865, and the Month That Saved America, which is the title of my program. Incidentally, I'm drawing from other books if I need them. The Real Lincoln, fascinating book by Thomas De Lorenzo. And then, of course, Bill O'Reilly, Killing Lincoln, a very accurate account of the assassination and the consequences after that. In addition, I have a copy of the New York Herald, and it mirrors the same facts of the Lincoln assassination that are presented in these books. So I know that it's genuine. A lot of research went into it. And we'll talk about Lincoln's assassination, which was also in April of 1865, and the enormous consequences that it had on the South. But let me read from this book, April 1865, and these remarks were made by one of the bravest, most valiant soldiers of the war, and that was Josh Chamberlain, 4 times governor of Maine. He taught at Bowdoin College, taught every subject there, and when the war swept him up, he was probably in his mid-30s. His father was a hero in the War of 1812. He was an amazing man. His first instinct was to go into the ministry, but he went into teaching instead. And this is what he had to say about these Confederate troops at Appomattox. Some of you have probably already read this or heard about it, but it's a very beautiful descriptive account. And the author of the book goes on to say, but on this April day in 1865, there was instead the formal stacking of arms and the last somber folding of battle flags. Men were not hanged. They were saluted. They were not jailed. They were honored. They were not humiliated or beaten. They were embraced. Some of this was designed. Much of it occurred totally spontaneously. All of it mattered, and it did matter a great deal. It sort of explains why we didn't turn out like Northern Ireland, or all the harsher edicts of history which say that civil wars only beget further civil wars and further division. You can look at Yugoslavia, the Balkans, the Russian provinces that have broken away, the Ukraine, Georgia. They never seem to work, but this, in our country, somehow, the Civil War brought this nation together. We were a nation that was put on paper. We didn't evolve over 1,000 years like the great nation states of Europe. We were placed on paper, and nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution at the time they were drafted around 1787 would you find any reference to a United States or to a nation or to a nationality. It talks about free, sovereign states. So in order to understand what happened in the 1860s, you have to look through the prism of the 1860s and what preceded it and how we formed this nation. But enough said about that. Let me read to you what Chamberlain had to say. On they came. This is the march down the road when the Confederate Army passed between 2 lines of Union soldiers. On they came with the old swinging route step and swaying battle flags, crowded so thick by thinning out of men that the whole column seemed crowned with red. In the van, the proud Confederate ensign Before us in proud humiliation stood the embodiment of manhood, men whom neither toils and sufferings, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor helplessness could bend from their resolve. Standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect and with, I can tell you, I can get pretty emotional reading about this. And with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together like no other bond. And Chamberlain recalls General Gordon wheeled his horse facing me, touching him gently with the spur so that the animal slightly reared, and as he wheeled, horse and rider made one motion. The horse's head swung down with graceful bow, and General Gordon dropped his sword point to his toe in salutation. And as he did, the veterans in blue gave a soldierly salute to those vanquished heroes, a token of respect from Americans to Americans. Gordon ordered his men to answer honor with honor. And then Chamberlain ended by saying, how could we help falling on our knees, all of us together, and praying God to pity and forgive us all? That was the end, or toward the end. There were other armies still in the field after April 1865. The last land battle was at a place in Texas called Palmetto Ranch, when a Union colonel wanted to make a name for himself, and about 800 men attacked about 300 Texas Rangers, and he was soundly defeated. That was probably in May of 1865. The last Confederate army that surrendered was General Stan Watie, a Cherokee Indian who commanded a company of Western Cherokees in Oklahoma. The very last flag down was on board the Shenandoah, a raider, and they had just destroyed a Union or maritime whaling fleet from New England in the Bering Sea. That was in the fall of 1865. They didn't realize that all the armies on the land had surrendered, and when they put in at San Francisco around November 1865, they realized that for all practical purposes the war was over. So they sailed back to England, crossed the equator for the 5th time. The ship was manned, not totally, but significantly by Englishmen. Captain Waddell of North Carolina was a skipper. The executive officer was from Norfolk, Virginia. They all came back and lived very prosperous lives. So the war ended in pieces. There was no formal surrender because the Confederacy was never recognized by the Lincoln government. As far as Lincoln was concerned, we were still citizens. We were just bad, crazy boys, rebels, but still citizens nevertheless. And I think it sort of bespeaks his character that he did in fact love us all, and he thought the war was tragic, but for various reasons he had to do it. I think one of the more base reasons from Lincoln's point of view was the tariff. He had plans to raise the tariff to about 47% on imports from Europe, and that would constitute about 90% of the revenue going to the federal government from less than 1/2 the population. Well, at that time, again looking through the prism of the 19th century world, that was unspeakable. You don't do that. That's tyranny. The South was turned into a vassalage state, totally subjugated by taxes that always, as you know, have the power to destroy. And then there's that grave constitutional question raised by Governor Ellis of North Carolina. My family was divided. Like this gentleman here, one of my great-grandfathers was in the 28th North Carolina Regiment, part of Lane's Brigade. His brother, also a North Carolinian, was on the Union side, and he was on Cemetery Ridge during the charge at Gettysburg, and it was his artillery that broke up that charge. That man was John Gibbon. And during the siege of Petersburg, Gibbon wanted to see his brother, and his brother refused to see him, would not speak to him. They never spoke to each other. My great-great-grandfather tried to reconcile the family, and he went to Baltimore and visited his maverick son, who sold out for the Union. He was unsuccessful. He died in Baltimore trying to bring the family back together. So there was a lot of aftermath of tragedy. There wasn't always a lot of love, but among the leaders of the army, there was a great deal of respect. They'd all fought together in the Mexican War. They all knew each other. They were all very close in what they referred to as the old army. Well, enough said about that. I'm going to run out of time. Again, I'm going to use these charts to sort of keep my thoughts in line with yours and not waste too much of your time. I would like to invite questions if we have time, and then as sort of a dessert, I'll try to recite for you Lee's farewell address to the Army of Northern Virginia. I'll do that last. But let's look, first of all, in order to understand how these armies were positioned. Remember that there were two significant armies in the Confederacy, one under Robert E. Lee, the Army of Northern Virginia, the other one under Joe Johnson, who was facing Sherman down in Georgia, South Carolina, and ultimately North Carolina. And the other armies were maybe a 5 or 6, like Chief Stanway and others that played no significant role. They were pretty well dissipated and exhausted. So the only hope in April of 1865 for the Confederacy were these two armies to link up. That is the only way they could win. Lee was a great risk taker. He had to be. With limited resources that he had to take risk, and as you know, he did it very successfully for nearly 4 years after he assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia. But let's look at, not flight, that's the wrong one, but let's look at what I call the waltz of death. This was ghastly. It was awful. Both sides were sparring for a fight. The Confederacy wanted to redeem itself after Gettysburg. The men in the Army of the Potomac realized that they'd been poorly led. They wanted to whip Bobby Lee. Grant kept telling them, don't worry about what Lee's going to do to us, let's just worry about what we're going to do to him. He was somewhat of an inspiring leader. You read about his previous life, you don't know how he came to that kind of stature, but he did nevertheless. Sometimes maybe the Almighty picks his champions from the people who you would consider losers, and Grant was certainly one of those prior to the outbreak of the war. But he was going to try again the overland route to Richmond. McClellan had tried it before, coming up the James and the York River on the Peninsula campaign, trying to get to Richmond. He failed. And you'll notice, and I don't know that you can see this map very clearly, these black lines represent the railroads. The blue line, of course, is the Union Army. The red line is the Confederate. You see the Chesapeake Bay out here in Maryland, Virginia, so forth. So, following Gettysburg, Lee was very upset with Meade because he allowed Lee to escape. Lee had pulled an army twice out of its endangerment, not just at Gettysburg, but he did the same thing at Antietam, brought them back intact. But of course Meade was in no shape to give much of a chase to Lee. But at this time, we talked about at the last meeting how the rivers were secured for the Union and the war at sea was going in favor of the Union. They pretty much controlled all the waterways. The South could not get material and other war supplies on the water, but they still had some railroads left. So what did the Union strategy be? Well, they're going to go after the railroads, obviously. So Grant is put in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Meade is still sort of a nominal commander, but by this time, Grant is the generalissimo of all the Union forces. He has Lincoln's total confidence. He's a general that'll fight. The others didn't prove their competence quite as well as Grant did. So Grant comes down, they meet at the Wilderness, the site of the old Battle of Chancellorsville, where Lee won a stunning victory. Some people compared it to Napoleon's Austerlitz. I don't know whether it was on that scale or not. And any other general following the Battle of the Wilderness, like Meade or McClellan or Pope or Burnside, would have gone back to Washington. Not Grant. Grant had, by that time, unlimited resources. He controlled the rivers and estuaries. The Union Army was capable, throughout the whole geography of the area, the whole South, of raising well over 1.5 million men. They had that capacity. The South had probably about 200,000 effectives, 200 to 250. Lee commanded at the Wilderness approximately 57,000 men. I don't know how many Grant had, but I do know that by the time he instituted the siege of Petersburg, his casualties exceeded 60,000, more than Lee had in his army. They could be replaced. The casualties in Lee's army could not be replaced. So things didn't look too good, but on the other hand, Lee stopped him at the Wilderness near the old battlefield of Chancellorsville, stopped him at Spotsylvania. Grant was trying to get to these railroads. One of the biggest was at Hanover, near the North Anna River and the Pamunkey. That was the Virginia Central Railroad, and Richmond Fredericks Railroad, and you see all these other railroads feeding in there from Petersburg and Richmond. If Grant could take those, he would take Richmond and he would starve Lee's army. Lee didn't have any other way to get foodstuffs and material in there. Incidentally, if you'll excuse my personal introspection, my great-grandfather was captured at Hanover. He was a battle surgeon, and when Lee pulled out, he took his wounded with him, but there were dying Union soldiers all over the field, and he wouldn't leave them. Some of those men were horribly mutilated, gut shot, and he stayed there and tried to treat them, and he was captured. And his captors felt so good about him, they sort of let him run loose around the camp. They needed doctors. And one day he said, I've got to go off in the woods and find a splint for this fellow. I think he's got a broken leg. I'll be right back. Well, as soon as he got out of sight, he started running. He swam across one of these roads and got down here just in time to be part of the siege of Petersburg. But he did survive. And I can tell you a wonderful story about him. I won't do it now, but man, certainly I didn't know, but I've heard about it and tend to worship him a little. Well, as Grant proceeded on down to Hanover, from Hanover Courthouse, he came to Cold Harbor. That was a very significant battle. At Cold Harbor, Grant loses about 7,000 men in a day making frontal assaults. You'd think that they learned better after Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. You just don't do that sort of thing. They obviously didn't understand Lee's position. Lee was a great artilleryman. He was an engineer. He designed Fort Pulaski in Savannah, Georgia. He was a brilliant man, and he knew how to use limited resources. When he got down here, after Cold Harbor, Grant realized that he couldn't bring Lee out into the open. Lee was going to stay on the defensive. He was doing quite well. He didn't like it. He would prefer to be a broken field runner, which he was, but he had no other choice. He thought Lee made a mistake in thinking that Richmond would be the Grant's target. General Beauregard told him different. He thought Petersburg would be the best target because that's where all these rail lines came in. If Grant could take those, you would automatically cut off Richmond, and the war might end. Well, Lee did not listen to Beauregard. I didn't think that was a sound plan. Kept most of his army around Richmond. Meanwhile, and he said, well, you know, if they try to cross the James River and get to Richmond, we of course would know about it, and then I can move troops down. Grant, to his favor, he got the whole army across the James River practically, and Lee didn't know about it. Beauregard was sitting down in Petersburg with about 2,000 Confederates. General William Baldy Smith was the Union Corps commander. He could easily have taken Petersburg. The thing that stopped him was his memory of Cold Harbor. What do those Confederates have up there? I might have to wait a while and sort of reconnoiter the position. Meanwhile, Lee got his army across the James down in Petersburg, and they went into siege warfare, which lasted approximately 10 months. Lee was anxious to find a way to break out and to break the siege, and he did that by trying to capture Fort Stedman, which is not on that map. Well, oh, here it is right here. He succeeded. He did take Fort Stedman. Problem is, he couldn't hold it. The Confederate army, or the men that he chose, divided up in groups of 100 men. The foremost were posing as Confederate deserters. The Union Army at Fort Stedman thought that they were going to join or surrender, and suddenly they attacked them, drove back that part of the Union forces commanding Fort Stedman, and Lee thought he would break through, break the siege, and get his army out of there. One of the problems was confusion set in, as it often did on a Civil War battlefield. The Union Army reconnoitered, and those poor Confederate troops were hungry. As soon as they came across rations, they stopped fighting and started eating. That slowed down the offensive. Union Army formed up, drove them back. And when Lee did that, he thinned the lines around Petersburg by the use of those men. That gave the Union Army the chance they needed. They broke through at Fire Forks, and that was the beginning of the end. And that was on April 1, 1865. Finally, we're getting into April of 1865, the beginning of the ultimate disaster for Lee. Lee got permission from Jefferson Davis to abandon Richmond and Petersburg. He left Jubal Early in charge of Petersburg to destroy all the munitions and everything in Petersburg and Richmond. Huge fires broke out. It was just a horrible mess. The plan was for the Confederate Army to converge at Amelia Courthouse, which is on the Richmond-Danville Railroad. And the design would be to go on down the Richmond-Danville Railroad to Danville, ultimately to Charlotte, Greensboro, and go on and join up with Joe Johnson and meet Sherman, come back around after defeating Sherman, and go back and beat Grant. What an audacious plan. But what else could you do? Nothing. There was no option. If you still wanted to hang in there and try to win, Lee was the most audacious commander this country has ever produced, in my humble judgment. The problem here, in this signal the death knell, there were supplies in Richmond, food on boxcars, perhaps 70,000 rations that were supposed to come out and meet these Confederate troops at Amelia Courthouse. They never showed up. The Army began to starve. They had no food stuffs. They did meet a train, but it was loaded with horses, harnesses, wagon wheels, some munitions, implements of war, but no food. What does Lee do? He has to forage the countryside. Well, that slows him down. Again, Grant is in hot pursuit. Lee had at least a day ahead of him to get his army out of there. But he had to feed his men, and by that time, fierce fighting broke out, and this railroad became blocked, and he had to keep going west. His ultimate destination would have been Lynchburg, Virginia. And along the way, troops marching in a column were extremely vulnerable. The only way that you could get any kind of warning for the arrival of enemy troops was to send out pickets. They were the human minefield, so to speak. And they would be on each side of a flanking a column. Each company and a regiment would take turns on picket duty. It was extremely hazardous. If the enemy got in between the pickets and the main army, they were either captured or slaughtered. But anyway, they were able to make it. Then something happened horribly at Sailor's Creek. Somehow the army, Lee's army, got divided, either because the pickets didn't do their job or they were thrust on each side of the army, on both sides, while they were in that column formation. Lee lost about 1/4 of his army at the Battle of Sailor's Creek. He was now down to a little over maybe between 20 and 30,000 men. His son was captured at Sailor's Creek. That was Custis Lee, who had gone to West Point. Also, one of his corps commanders, Ewell, was captured. Meanwhile, back at Five Forks, A.P. Hill, another corps commander, was killed. So Lee was losing his senior management as well as the rest of his army. And then after that, he reached a point where he had to cross the Appomattox River again, and he tried to burn all the bridges behind him, but he couldn't do it. One of them was made of mortar and stone, and he couldn't dismantle it. So he couldn't escape, but in that vicinity there was another little sharp fight, which offered some encouragement, a little place called Farmville, I believe. And the Confederate Army took 300 prisoners, captured one Union general, and killed another. So, things might be possible. The Army kept going. And then By the time they reached Appomattox Station, because of the delay, perhaps at Amelia Courthouse and these other fierce battles, the Union Army caught up with them. Phil Sheridan had just come from the Shenandoah Valley, which he just laid it to waste. He brought up about 6,000 more cavalrymen. The Army of the James moved up against Lee. George Armstrong, Custer, the boy general, literally tore up his whole baggage train and captured Cannon at Appomattox Station. Lee sends out General Gordon to reconnoiter the position, finds out that it's hopeless. Meanwhile, he gets these messages from Grant saying, why don't we talk about your capitulation? Why have this further effusion of blood? You're not going to win. Lee replies fairly defiantly, saying that wasn't the case at all. And this is all spelled out for you in this book, April 1865, I think it's a must read. And but finally he realizes that he's got to surrender. Days earlier, around Five Forks, he told his officers, every man must resolve to die at his post. At this point, he wasn't thinking about the officers, he was thinking about his men and how to get them out of this predicament, how much he loved them, and he just wanted to save them and get the most favorable terms from Grant. Grant was indeed very charitable, and many scholars think that's because of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, by this time, was on the James River at City Point, not too far from Richmond. He was on board this riverboat, the River Queen. He met with Grant and other generals and said, let's let them down easy. We better make them an offer that they can't refuse. What they feared most was guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare, and to see what was that like, all they had to do was look at the state of Missouri. The atrocities that were going on in Missouri and Kansas were just awful. Partisan fighters that weren't really clearly on one side or the other. People like Quantrill, there was another character, and they had some young teenagers there, like the James brothers, the younger brothers, that would rob trains in the 1870s. They didn't care about anything. They were just pirates and brigands. And the horrors that were placed upon the native population was so great that whole counties were being abandoned. Well, Lee saw that, and he said, I can't do that to the state of Virginia. That's unheard of. It's not honorable. It's not war. And the person that really thought along the lines of guerrilla warfare was Jefferson Davis. He says, we'll never give up. And as we go down south, we encounter folks. I don't want my time to run out too much, but remember what Lee's original plan was to follow the Richmond-Danville Railroad, come in here and join up Johnson and hit Sherman. Let's see what was going on down there in April of 1865. In order to sort of set it up, you'll recall that, or may recall that Jefferson Davis blamed Joe Johnson for the loss of Vicksburg. Somehow Grant's army got in between Johnson and Vicksburg. Johnson couldn't relieve Vicksburg. The general in charge of the Confederate forces in Vicksburg couldn't get out to team up with Johnson. Whether Grant was just lucky, or whether or not it was just sound Napoleonic strategy, I don't know, but that's what happened. So Davis was a little dubious about Johnson, didn't really trust him with the fabled Army of the West. And as it so happened, Johnson was a student of this famous Roman general that finally beat Hannibal. just by attrition. And he stopped them pretty well at near Atlanta. I can't think of the name of it.
Was it Kennesaw
The
Mountain?
mountain there, some of you might know.
Kennesaw.
Yeah, you're right. And he was doing a right credible job, but Davis says, I've got to have a fighting general in there. Johnson is just too slow. Sort of like the way Lincoln accused McClellan of having the slows. So he replaced Johnson with this wild guy by that time, John Bell Hood, who had terrible issues. He was almost a double amputee. He lost a leg above the knee at either Gettysburg or Chickamauga, and at one of those other battles also he lost the use of one of his arms. He was also spurned by a girl in Richmond that he was trying to court in that condition. That didn't do him any good. He was in constant pain. He had the availability of morphine. He became a little bit hallucinogenic. He tried to punish his army because they allowed the Union Army to get out and get up into Tennessee and prepared trenches, and you had the Battle of Franklin and the Battle of Nashville, and the Confederate Army was just about totally annihilated. The only reason it wasn't is because a fellow named Nathan Bedford Forrest happened to be operating in that area somewhat independently, and he's credited with saving the Army. Also, John Bell Hood was sent into retirement. Joe Johnson was recalled and placed back in command of what was left of the remnants. Meanwhile, Sherman had won the battles, or he was George Thomas, the battles around Chattanooga, where the Union Army was pinned up, Lookout Mountain and Pilot Mountain, which was scandalous defeats for the Confederate Army. Placement of the cannon wasn't properly done. They couldn't shoot down. They had to shoot over the Union Army's head, and companies of the Union Army, just on their own volition, stormed the heights, took it away from the Confederates, and as soon as they broke out of Chattanooga, Sherman divined this plan to just follow the railroad track from Chattanooga down to Atlanta and proceed on across Georgia and swing up through the Carolinas and just cut the South in two and make war on the civilians, the advent of a modern war, destroy their war machine. Lincoln reluctantly gave him the go-ahead, and Sherman's army were nothing less than hardcore veterans. The only thing opposing them in Georgia were militia units. Governor Brown of Georgia didn't get along too well with Jefferson Davis. Neither did Governor Vance of North Carolina. They thought Davis was getting a little bit too dictatorial, trying to centralize the government, which they were against in the first place, and it looked like we were repeating it all over again, conscripting 4-year-old, 14-year-old boys to fight in the Army. Unheard of. You just don't do that sort of thing. But to make a long story short, they got down here, and this had tremendous political implications. When they took Savannah on December 21, 1864, that assured Lincoln of a second term. 80% of the Union soldiers, this was, I think, done by absentee voting in those days, voted in favor of Lincoln. They weren't about to quit. They knew they were going to win. The North was, by the time, galvanized. Like I say, there was a capability of raising well over 1 million men if necessary. So by that time, the North had pretty much of a free hand. They thought Sherman was going to Charleston, but he didn't. He went to Columbia instead and burned it to the ground. My great-grandmother was in Charleston. She evacuated South Carolina. It was a pretty terrible time. They thought Sherman was coming in there. And legend had it, she met my great-grandfather near Davidson, where they were married, and ultimately settled in Mecklenburg County. Meanwhile, Johnson tries to defeat Sherman.